All right, it's good to see everybody. Yeah, so this sounds like it's making some noise. Oh, is that your sound machine? Ed, hey.
Oh,
Oh,
I can't hear you.
I know, but they have a sound machine going.
Oh, over there?
Yeah. So if you see me falling asleep up here, it's a combination of the delivery of Daniel 8 plus the sound machine over here going that I'm going to fall asleep. All right, we'll get started here in just a second. I wanted, on Sunday, we're going to make an announcement on Sunday that says Caleb and Kristen Mantle are members now of our church family. But they're not going to be here on Sunday, but they're here right now. And so we talked to them on Sunday, and they have said they want to join our family here at Ellisville, and we're happy about that, their decision to do that. And so if you have a chance to talk with them tonight, they're going to be gone for the next, 2 weeks or so. They got some family vacation things coming up. But anyway, we're really glad you guys are here. And then we'll start in Daniel chapter 8. Let's have a word of prayer. Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this beautiful day that you've blessed us with, and for this opportunity where we can come together to study from your word. We pray that as we read through Daniel 8, that we can make application from these ancient times all the way to our life today. We ask that you be with the other classes that meet tonight. We ask that you be with Norma and her family, and just take care of them. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, Daniel chapter 8. Last week, obviously, we did chapter 7, and chapter 8 is very much just like the next part of what we've been studying. And I'm going to start by saying that this whole book of Daniel is, before teaching this class, and even as I'm teaching this class, has been a little bit intimidating just because it's pretty deep stuff. But as I go through it and study through it, and hopefully you guys are able to get some of this, it makes a whole lot more sense to me, and it's not as hard to understand if you stand back and you look at the big picture of it, and hopefully after tonight's class, you'll see even more of that. Next week, I'm going to be out of town, and Jesse is going to teach in my place chapter 9. So let's start with Daniel chapter 8, and we'll read verses 1 and 2. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first, the one we studied last week. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai Canal. So, just so you know where we're at, I know this is a small map, but Susa is about right here, okay? And Babylon is over in this area. But he's down there in Susa and in this vision. In this book, or this chapter, there's 2 main sections. Verses 1 through 14 is Daniel's vision, and then verses 15 through 27 is understanding that vision, or what does it mean. And when we go through it, we're going to kind of bounce from the vision to the understanding, and from the vision to the understanding. We're not just going to go through it numerically. And this class is simply a history lesson. There's no weird or scary religious stuff. That's kind of how I might have thought about it prior to getting into this class. You know, there's a lot of just, what? It's really not that difficult. to understand when you go through it. And it is really more of a history lesson. And what's interesting is it's a history lesson to us, but when this was written before the history had happened, which is very interesting, I think, that we have written for us the things that are going to happen before they happen. And they happened almost exactly, I say almost, I haven't studied it to know if there's any this or that, okay? But from everything I can tell, it happened exactly like it says it's going to happen in this account. And I don't have any problem believing that. There are some folks who say that this was written after history, but that's not true. It was written before the history. In Rob's class last week on Sunday, or this week on Sunday, in Jeremiah chapter 27, it talked about Nebuchadnezzar was going to rule, and his son and his grandson, and then they would be replaced. Well, that was written before that had happened, and nobody discounts when that was written. I don't think there's any reason why we should say this wasn't written when it was written. There's other examples. If you want to study it more on your own, feel free to do so. But in these first few verses, we're going to see a picture of a ram and a male goat with a single horn. And then that single horn becomes broken, and it's replaced by 4 horns. And then out of one of the 4 horns, a little horn becomes great. And this chapter is ultimately about this little horn and how bad that little horn is. And he is literally the picture of the Antichrist. You know, in the New Testament, you hear about the Antichrist. He paints that picture, this guy we're going to talk about. And horns. How many of you guys know anything about horns on animals? A little bit. You know, anybody have experience with rams or goats? I'm not talking about your truck, your Ram truck, but your goats. I think, Paul, you had a goat. Okay. And the goats, you know, they've got these little horns, and they will headbutt you to no end. They like to get up on their hind leg and just run up at you and knock you over if they can, and they think it's fun. And sometimes, I don't know about goat horns, but cow horns. My grandpa was a cowboy, and we had lots of cows or interactions with cows, and horns can break. You know, they break off, and when they break off, it's kind of gross. It's kind of ugly in there, a lot of blood and everything. But when it grows back, or if it grows back, it doesn't grow back, or whatever grows back, doesn't grow back like it originally was. It's more deformed, and it looks, jagged or whatever. Kind of like my thumbnail. I injured my thumbnail 27 years ago, and if you want to come look up at it, it doesn't look like a regular thumbnail, and it's from an injury a long time ago. They grow back different. So for me to understand how horns can break off and something else grow and whatever, that doesn't seem mystical to me. It just seems that it could happen, and I can understand it. All right. Let's talk about the ram. Let's talk about this ram, verses 3 and 4. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one horn was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and he became great. So this ram is traveling from which direction? It said it's traveling in all directions, really. It's charging westward and northward and southward. So it's taking over. This ram is not really a ram, okay? It's a king. It's a new empire, and he's taking over all these lands. Who is the ram? Do we really have to wonder? I mean, I kind of do when I get into verse 4. But if you jump to verse 20, it says, we don't have to wonder. It says, as for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And remember when we were back in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 32, the second part of that statue was included with the arms of silver, the two arms of silver. That was the Medes and the Persians. So tonight we're talking about this dream in chapter 8, but there was a dream in chapter 2 where it's the same image, or same interpretation is the same, but through different images. And then Daniel chapter 7, it was represented as the bear that was raised up on one side. And even then, in chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 2, chapter 7, all these different chapters, we have that it's the Medes and the Persians is who this is. The arms of silver are the Medes and the Persians. The bear is the Medes and the Persians. And now we have this ram with the two horns, Medes and the Persians. And last week we talked about how it's raised up on one side. And when you look at that map, see how the territory is greater on one side than the other physically? That give you an idea of the ram's horn? Okay. When Daniel was writing this, he was writing it during the time of Babylon. And historically, the Medo-Persian Empire conquered Babylon in 539 BC. So on this map, you have Babylon is right in this area, and the Medes and the Persians came over from this area, this Persia right there. So now let's talk about the male goat. Let's read verses 5 through 7. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west, across the face of the whole earth, without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the two horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at it in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram, and broke his two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. So in this picture, you see this is a goat up here in the top left, and he looks like he has a unicorn horn. He has one horn, and he's headbutting the ram who had the two horns. And when he hit it, the two horns of the ram came off. Now, if you've ever seen the videos of the two rams headbutting each other and the loud percussive sound that has, just imagine the great force that was rendered to make those horns come off. Now again, we're talking about a kingdom, taking over another kingdom. And we're talking about how he was coming down so fast, his legs weren't even touching the ground. It was quick, it was swift. Who is the male goat? Again, we don't have to wonder about this. In verse 21, it says, and the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. So Greece had a first king, and that's what that single horn was, the first king. And from Daniel's perspective, the goat was coming from the west, and that would have been Greece. And without touching the ground, he was flying. Remember, it said like in Daniel chapter 7, it was like a leopard with four wings. And remember the four wings, and this one's going to have four horns, this goat. These things correlate to each other. Mike's falling asleep, and he did turn the sound machine off. It's all right. Sorry, Mike. Okay, and then Alexander the Great would be the first king or ruler of the Greek Empire, and he conquered the Persian Empire between 334 to 331 BC. And then that great horn was broken. So that guy's horn, the unicorn horn, was broken, and it was replaced by four horns. So remember what I said, when It's not too hard for me to understand that when something breaks off, something else grows in its place. You see that in nature sometimes. So, and I'm not trying to say that this was a natural thing. I'm not trying to say that. But I'm just saying you can understand one thing breaks off and something else grows back. The great horn was broken and replaced by 4 horns. So let's read verse 8. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Jump down to verse 22. It says, as for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from this nation, from his nation, but not with his power. So in 323 BC, Alexander the Great died. And when he died, his kingdom was divided among 4 of his generals. And we talked about this a little bit last week too. And I realize this is so small you can't read it, but you can read the names of the new kings over here, the ones that the 4 generals that it went to. So you have the Seleucus, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Cassander. And you can see the different colors here on the map where they took their reign from. And then remember also we talked about them being the leopard with the 4 heads. So I know this is like a lot of the repetition, but I think that's part of what Daniel's trying to tell us, that this is not to be treated as just one dream and then another dream and then another dream. They're not all separate from each other. These things are all tied together. And they're tied together hopefully for us to understand the main purpose of this book of Daniel. And when we get to the end tonight, hopefully we're able to draw that conclusion and see what it's been talking about. Any comments or questions? Okay. Now, for the Bible study purposes of what we're doing tonight and throughout this class, those 4 kingdoms up there on the left, only 2 of them really matter to our discussion about what's been going on. And those are Ptolemy. He took Egypt and most of Israel. And then Seleucus, he took modern-day Turkey and the Middle East, which is a huge territory. So the green area and the red area are the main 2 that I'm going to say that matter to us the most, because that's the land in which God's people were from and where they were at. And so that's why I care about those parts of this history more than others. And these, just so you know, these kings, that Ptolemy and Seleucus, they took those areas. And we don't know all of this yet, but when we get to chapter 11, it's going to actually be about Ptolemy and Seleucus and their kingdoms and how they were fighting between each other for this land of Israel. So that there is a big part of the story of Daniel is this fighting over the land of Israel. And so for now, just so you know, before we get to it, I'm just going to tell you a little bit. In 198 BC, the Seleucids finally secure Israel. So about 200 years before the time of Christ, they secure Israel. And then we'll talk about this little horn. Well, that's a bigger picture. Hey, you can see what I was talking about. The 2 that mattered the most are Seleucus and Ptolemy. And there's the green and the red that represent them. All right. Let's talk about this little horn in chapter 8, verse 9. Out of one of them, after the 4 horns get broken off, out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offerings because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Can anybody explain that to me? What are we talking about here? This fourth, out of the one of the four horns that gets broken off, one of them grows, and it grows exceedingly fast, and it has a lot of power. But what's it doing? What do we see it talking about here?
Persecution that's coming upon the Jerusalem, Jewish people, not just Jerusalem, Jewish people by that new horn.
Yeah, so a lot of persecution is coming to the Jewish people by way of this horn. This guy, Antiochus, and he calls himself Epiphanes, but he was a strong believer in Hellenization. He turned the entire world language Greek. Their culture was Greek. The money was Greek. He did a lot of things to change the culture in the entire empire that he was now ruling over. He ruled between 175 through 163 BC. And he was by all measures the worst king as far as the Jewish people were concerned, because of the way he persecuted them, killed them, mocked them, didn't allow them to do the things that they should have been able to do. He set up, well, I want to make sure I make this point. He did a lot of bad things. But some of the things that he did, even while doing these bad things, he did change the language to Greek. He changed the culture to Greek. This religion, the Greek gods, the money, all these things were changed. And as I was reading that, it made me think about in Mark chapter 1 and verse 3, and John the Baptist, when he said that he was there to prepare the way of the Lord. And the reason that made me think of this, not because John the Baptist did bad things, but John the Baptist was preparing the way for the Lord. But in a dark sort of way, this guy, Antiochus, did very much of the same things, because he changed the language to one language across the empire. What language do we see Jesus and them speaking in sometimes, right? Greek, that was still a language that they were using. And the Hellenistic Jews, remember them in Acts chapter 6, 4, and 5? It was still a part of the culture of what happened. And then take that a little bit further, one of the next kings that we'll talk about is Rome. But they did very much of the same thing. They had roads that went from all different parts of the kingdom, and they had this general peace at the time of Christ, so it allowed folks to travel and do things. But so out of some of these horrible things that we're actually talking about came some good things, if you can think of it that way, that allowed Christianity to flourish when it did. Okay, back to this. This guy set up an image of the Greek god Zeus in the temple. In God's temple, he set up the Greek god Zeus. Is that a big deal? I think that's a big deal. He offered pigs, unclean animals, on the altar. You know, we talked about with Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, and Nebuchadnezzar took the vessels from the temple and just placed them in his temple. Belshazzar took those vessels and drank from them. But this guy sets up a temple idol in God's temple of Zeus, and then they offer pigs on the altar. That's very, very bad. I'm scratching. You gotta be careful. Even the camera trained on you. He encouraged Greek soldiers to fornicate inside the temple. He forbade Jews from circumcising their boys according to the law of Moses. He forbade Jews from observing the Sabbath. He forbade Jews from having the scriptures. They wouldn't even allowed to have the Old Testament scriptures. And to this point, this guy that we're talking about, he is the supreme persecutor and oppressor of God's people. It's kind of what Eric was saying earlier. This guy was bad news. So let's think about themes of Daniel. How can we take something out of this and apply it to the whole book of Daniel and then make application to ourselves? We're not done with the class, but I think this is a good part to say this. During the book of Daniel, we see this theme of authority. Nebuchadnezzar has authority over everybody. Belshazzar had authority over everybody. These different kings, they had authority over everybody. The people, God's people, the Jewish people. And they get persecuted. Remember when we go all the way back to the beginning of the book, who was persecuted? Daniel was persecuted, right? He got, one of them was he got thrown in the lion's den. But then he was delivered, okay? We're going to see that kind of theme throughout the book of Daniel. You're going to see men in power. They're going to persecute the people, but ultimately the people will be delivered. But that message isn't just for Daniel. It's for us as well. It's even for Regan. Waving at me. I don't know why. Okay. We get persecuted in this world, and we need to remember, not that it's okay to get persecuted. Think bigger, though. Don't worry about it. We're going to be delivered one day. God is in control. I want to read a couple passages from the book of Maccabees. So read with me. It says, "And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the cities of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices, and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and feasts, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars, and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and unclean animals." So this is not from the Bible, but this is extra biblical history that we can see that these things took place. And then there's the interpretation. Let's look back at Daniel chapter 8, verse 23 through 25. This interpretation even points towards Antiochus operating under the power of evil spiritual forces, maybe Satan himself. Read verse 23. "And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power, and he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand." So here we have it again, Antiochus, and he called himself Epiphanes, which means God manifest, or appearing of God. And you imagine that that's who your ruler is, declares himself to be of such greatness and power. Not only does he say that he is these things, but he delivers on a lot of these types of things by his retribution and his, saying, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And he does it without warning, and he does it swiftly, and he's very fierce. And God's people, they had to live through this, die through this. But ultimately, God is in charge. So notice again the theme, where the ruler thinks only of himself. And I know we're talking right now about this guy, but I see a theme throughout the book of Daniel where the ruler gets too high and mighty and starts thinking too much of himself and not thinking of his subjects or his people, anything but himself. That's all he thinks about. Do I ever get that way? Yeah. I mean, that's human nature, I think, that we tend to get that way. And I'm not trying to justify it, but it happens. You know, whatever power we think we have, sometimes we puff our chest out and we act like we're everything that is, you know, and we want to exert our power on any of those that we feel are beneath us, and we don't care about the consequences. And you see that in our leadership in any type of government you want to talk about. You see it in civic clubs. You see it at work. You see it in neighborhood interactions with the person who thinks he's better than everybody else on the street. You know what I mean? It's not just the president of the country or the king of a nation. It can be anybody that gets this way. But it's really bad what happened in here. But it reminds me of how Judah went. You know, go all the way back to when the Israelites declared to God that they wanted a king like everybody else. And God said, okay, I'll let you have it, but this is what's going to happen. And if you follow history throughout, all the way till the last king right before they go into Babylon here, that's exactly what happened. That king thought he was everything there was to be, but he was doing everything in what he thought was right in his own sight, didn't care about anything else. So we're talking about this guy and how bad he was, but really the guy from the kings of Judah weren't any better. And then you had the kings of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't any better than that. He thought he was better than everybody else. Cyrus, the Greeks, we'll get to the Romans in a little bit. But who is our king now? And does he think of himself like that, or does he think of himself differently? And so when I was going through the list of all these horrible kings, and then we get to Jesus Christ, who's our king now, who does he think about when he's sitting on his throne? Is he thinking about himself and all the power that he wields and what he's going to do with that? I mean, that's not what I read about when I hear that. He's thinking of you and I and how to protect us and save us, and he gave himself for us. Totally opposite of what these other guys are doing. Any comments on that, Ryan?
I like the comparison between this guy who came in and spread all the Greek culture, and then what the Babylonians were doing in chapter 1. You're going to get a new name, we're going to change your diet, and all of these different movements of forced conformity. And it's like, oh wow, that's so difficult for God's people to go through that. But I like your point where you said, you know, some of their own kings in Judah were doing those exact same things. I think about like Asa's mom, who was putting up idols in high places because she was the mother of the king and had authority to do so. I think it's just a good warning that, yes, we're always aware of not conforming to the culture, but also that there might be people with good intentions or bad intentions.
Yeah.
Maybe of God's people.
That's right. And in Rob's class on Jeremiah, we were just talking about how the people of Judah were sacrificing their children to this false god. So just being an Israelite or a Judean, a person of God's family, doesn't protect you from falling into these horrible traps of the things we're talking about. So don't ever let us get caught up in thinking that, well, I'm a Christian, I don't do that. Well, I hope you don't do that. But just because you say you're a Christian doesn't mean you're exempt from perhaps falling into that kind of stuff. And then before I change the slide, I just want to mention this. God promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that their descendants would be more numerous than the stars of the sky. And Antiochus caused the stars to fall from heaven. And I don't know exactly where that quote came from, except to say it came from Ryan Boyer's notes. But he might have pulled it from somewhere, I don't know. But isn't that profound, I think, that that's how many people are being taken out by Antiochus. So the conclusion and point of Daniel is verses 13 through 14. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." So the point of this chapter falls in line with the rest of the message of Daniel. The rulers and kingdoms of man often elevate themselves even to levels of divinity and often persecute God's people, but God is ultimately in control and all his enemies will be destroyed eventually. We need to remember that. Oh, another slide from the book of Maccabees. 2 Maccabees 9 and verse 5. Again, this is extra biblical, but it is historical. But the all-seeing Lord, the God of Israel, struck him, Antiochus, an incurable and unseen blow. As soon as he ceased speaking, he was seized with a pain in his bowels for which there was no relief, and with sharp internal tortures. And then in verse 10 of that same chapter, it says, because of his intolerable stench, no one was able to carry the man who a little while before had thought that he could touch the stars of heaven. And we think we're very, very powerful until something bad like this happens, right? Or just think about this. You think everything's going great until, everything's going great. I just came from Chick-fil-A tonight, had dinner with many of you guys, and as we're coming out, one of the ladies that works there, Barbie, says, "You guys all go to the Church of Christ here in Ellisville? That's awesome. You guys are I can tell, I can just feel that you guys really have a love for each other, the way you interact with, we're all sitting across the restaurant. We're not all sitting at the same table. We just walk up and say hi to whoever's there. And this lady notices that. And she sees the various people that come. So I'm on high. As I leave there, I'm thinking, ooh, yeah. So I'm turning to come to the church building. I'm making a point, okay, about how you can be the king of the world and then something bad happens and all of a sudden you're not, right? I'm trying to turn right, and there's a guy in front of me. There's two lanes. One lane turns to the left, and in the other lane, you can go straight across or turn to the right. And there's a guy in front of me, and he's got his left-hand turn signal on, and he's wanting to turn across that way. And so I was frustrated because, why? You know what I mean? Anyway, just something so simple can really turn you. And then Nora, I need to watch what I say, because right after Nora said, "Papa, I gave them a raspberry for you." So, yeah, not bad Papa right here. All right, let's read some more. Daniel chapter 8, verses 15 through 27. We're going to read some about the ram and the goat, these four kingdoms, and then that king with a bold face. All right, verse 15. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, "Gabriel, make this man understand the vision." So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, "Understand, O Son of Man, that the vision is for the time of the end." And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me stand up. He said, "Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is its first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power, and he shall cause fearful destruction and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. Saints, remember, means set apart. You know, it's a group of people. These are God's people. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision, and I did not understand it. When I first read that last verse, it struck me to think that all this stuff that he just went through is very disturbing. Yeah, but what happens when you get disturbing news? Do you ever lose sleep over it? When you get disturbing news, even though you know you're not supposed to worry about things and you put things in God's hands, you still kind of have an upset stomach a little bit about the horrible thing you just saw or heard or witnessed. And in verse 27 it says, Daniel was appalled by the vision. And initially he didn't understand it. But can you imagine hearing a story about all of God's people being murdered and killed and tortured and suffering and all these things that are going to happen in the future? Because as we're reading it, it already happened in the past. But when Daniel's reading it, he knows that these things are going to happen to people who aren't even here yet. And it's very disturbing. You know, it just made him really think. He got sick about it. But after a few days, he went back to the king's business. So there's even a lesson in that. You know, maybe we do become distraught and sick over something, but eventually we need to get back to work. We need to get back in the saddle and keep on going. It's okay to be distraught, but eventually we need to get back on our 2 feet and start working. Right?
If I were Daniel, I think that this would really scare me too, because he's had visions and predictions before of empires turning over other empires, and they're horrible. They're violent. It's just massive calamities, like when Darius took over in chapter 5. And I'm just trying to think for ourselves what we do when we're promised in the New Testament that there is going to be unrighteous people. There are going to be haters of God, haters of truth, and we're promised that. It's a guarantee. It's going to happen, and it is very discouraging. But I think in the same way, knowing that just like those kingdoms pass, so too the uncomfortable and unfriendly interactions that we have.
That's right. And that's some comfort in that, knowing that eventually God rules over all. We may have to suffer in our life a little bit, but God is over all. So things are bad sometimes, but remember, God is in control, and God will take care of you. If not in this life, in the next life. God will take care of you. Put it in his hands. History tells us these things happen, and we're no different. Those things may happen to us, but what we need to remember is God is in control. And then get back to work. So, all right, we're out of time. Thank you.